This is more than a murder. This is a historical mystery, and to solve it, we must trace the turbulent, painful, and controversial life of the king the world turned its back on. On the 21st of September, 1327, in the cold darkness of Berkeley Castle, a silent execution took place without public view, without honor, only blood, fire, and the sound of burning flesh. A middle-aged man lay motionless on a rotten wooden bed. His hair was streaked with grey, his eyes were dim, and his wrists and ankles were deeply marked with chains. He had been King Edward II of England, a Plantagenet monarch now, a forgotten prisoner. As night fell, two strangers entered with a red-hot iron. No questioning, no sentence, just dead silence. A horn was inserted into his anus. Then the hot iron was pushed in. There was no blood, no external wound. Just his internal organs were burned, and his screams were muffled in his pillow. The next morning, he was found dead, his face contorted as if frozen in his final agony. The official record said he died of natural causes. But was it true? Or was it an execution disguised as the silence of power? There are men born under the halo of the throne, but fate has written a curse on their foreheads. In 1284, in the cold stone walls of Caernarfon Castle, in the windswept land of Wales, a child let out his first cry, not knowing that it would lead to one of the most terrible tragedies in European royal history. That child was Edward, son of the infamous King Edward I, whom the Scots called by the tremulous name of their hammer. But Edward was no warrior. The blood of a conqueror flowed in his veins, but his heart belonged to the dreamy and fragile, water, crafts, and relationships that the court called disreputable. When his brothers fell one by one, the throne fell upon him like a heavy crown of thorns, and his father, the Iron King, found nothing but disappointment. In his rage, the king is recorded as having pulled out handfuls of his hair. Of a son whom he considered disgraceful for daring to claim a title for the man, the kingdom whispered to him as his lover Piers Gaveston, a nobleman from Gascony, who would later lead Edward into a quagmire of intrigue, betrayal, and an untimely death. When Edward I died in 1307, the English throne fell not to a warrior, but to a 23-year-old with a heart for what the court considered ridiculous. As soon as he became king, Edward II acted as if he were avenging years of contempt for his father. He immediately recalled his exiled friend Piers Gaveston, despite the late king's previous prohibition. And not only did Edward bring Gaveston back, he also gave him a powerful title, Earl of Cornwall, a title reserved for royal blood. The new king did not stop there, but he ignored all traditional restrictions. Gaveston was given possession of the most sacred regalia of the kingdom, which he had just inherited from his father, and on the day of his coronation, this outsider appeared with the crown of St. Edward on his head, as if he were a co-ruler. To the aristocracy, this was an insult, blatant. The true nature of Edward II's relationship with Gaveston has been a matter of debate since the 14th century. Contemporary accounts describe a bond so intense that the king vowed to remain loyal to his friend as a loyal knight. Some modern scholars argue that this was an exaggeration of the tradition of male brotherhood in chivalry. But later records are more direct. In 1334, a bishop publicly accused the late Edward of sodomia, a medieval term for homosexuality. Whatever the truth, Edward's actions with Gaveston plunged the court into crisis. In 1308, Edward married the 12-year-old Princess Isabella of France as part of a political alliance between the two kingdoms. But during the wedding ceremony, his eyes and heart were not on his bride, but on Gaveston. Worse still, his wedding gift Isabella's precious jewels were kept by Gaveston himself. The humiliation suffered by the young bride became a thorn in the side of the French royal family. This arrogance not only angered foreign countries, but also fueled the anger of the English nobility, especially Thomas, Earl of Lancaster, the king's cousin. They forced Edward to exile Gaveston, but he quickly welcomed his friend back. This vicious cycle continued until 1312, when Gaveston was captured by a group of barons and brutally executed by the roadside, stabbed and beheaded on the spot. Edward fell into despair, vowed revenge, but in reality, he was forced to pretend to reconcile with the murderers of his beloved. Gaveston's death was not the end of Edward's series of political mistakes. On the battlefield, he was defeated miserably by the Scots at Bannockburn in 1314, losing the lands his father had won. In governing the country, he let the treasury empty, and power fell into the hands of Edward's new favourites, the Despenser family. Hugh Despenser, father and son, exploited the king's blind trust to amass wealth, seize land, kill enemies, and turn the kingdom into a tool of personal revenge. Once again, Edward's blind loyalty plunged the country into bloodshed. As Isabella's youth and charm faded under the heavy shadow of her husband's favourites, a feeling that went beyond resentment began to grow within her. Hatred. Not just directed at the Despensers, but more deeply, a loathing of the man she had once called her husband. The final straw came in 1325, when she was sent to France on a diplomatic mission. Instead of returning, Isabella publicly declared that she would not return while the Despensers remained in power. In France, she was not alone. There, Isabella met Roger Mortimer, a noble who had escaped from the Tower of London after being imprisoned for rebellion. A passionate, political relationship quickly developed between them. They became allies, and the most dangerous lovers of their time. In September 1326, they landed in England with a small army, but it carried the weight of a declaration of war. Surprisingly, the people and the nobility did not resist. They welcomed Isabella and Mortimer as liberators from the tyranny of King Edward and the hated men who surrounded him. Edward, along with the Despensers, fled west but were quickly captured. The death of Hugh Despenser the Younger became a symbol of the fury of the kingdom. Brought to the execution ground like a criminal, he was dragged behind a horse, hung on a gallows as a living spectacle, but not dead. He was dragged down, castrated in public, his body still breathing as his genitals were thrown into a fire. Then his entrails were removed and burned in pieces before their eyes. Finally, his head was cut off and placed on London Bridge as a grisly warning. Edward, however, was not killed immediately. Instead, he was forced to abdicate in January 1327, handing the throne over to his son, the then 14-year-old Edward III. Edward was initially kept under gentle house arrest, but from April he was moved to Berkeley Castle, a cold prison for the former king. Two names appear in the final accounts of his life: John Maltravers and Thomas Gurney, who are said to have been in charge of his guards. There, the disgraced king was kept in increasingly filthy conditions, forced to ride bare-chested so that his skin would blister and fester. No throne, no honor, just a body that was consumed by humiliation and silent pain. They didn't need blood, they just needed him to stop breathing. A natural death was how Isabella and Mortimer hoped to end Edward II's existence without committing the crime of regicide, which was once considered a direct challenge to the will of God. But Edward, frail and chained, lived longer than they expected. His days of imprisonment had not killed his will. And then, as rumors of a plot to rescue him began to leak through the cracks in the castle walls, another decision was made, silently but deadly. On the night of the 21st of September, 1327, Berkeley Castle froze. The cold seeped through the stone, enveloping the cell in the dungeons. There, a man was no longer king, no longer man, just a tortured body, waiting for the worst. What happened that night? The most famous version comes not from living witnesses, but from the chronicles. The story was written decades later. In it, it is said, a horn tube was inserted into Edward's anus. Through it, a red-hot iron rod was pushed deep into his body, burning every inch of his intestines without leaving a single external wound. A clean death, without blood, without evidence, but with a cold, chilling cruelty. Geoffrey Le Baker, a medieval historian, recorded the description in 1350. However, modern historians have begun to peel back the gruesome mask. They question, was this true or just the product of a propaganda machine? Edward III, the son of Edward II, who executed Mortimer and imprisoned his own mother, may have spread the story to sow the image of a despicable traitor. The torture with the red-hot iron rod also evoked rumors about the king's sexual orientation, creating a painful symbol of the relationship between flesh and power, between lust and hope of being punished and social order restored. Some researchers point out that if Edward had wanted to be killed without leaving a trace, there were more sophisticated and practical methods, such as strangling him with a pillow. But there is another, more haunting question. What if he had not died? In 1333, a strange letter known as the Fieschi letter was sent to King Edward III. In it, an Italian cleric claimed to have heard Edward II himself confess his crimes many years after his supposed death. He said that the deposed king had escaped from Berkeley Castle, switched bodies with an anonymous porter, traveled throughout Europe, and finally lived in seclusion in Italy as a ghost in monk's robes. The story did not end there. In 1338, at the court of the Holy Roman Empire, a mysterious man named William of Wales appeared and claimed to be Edward II. He might have been an impostor, or maybe he really was. Regardless, whatever the truth, one fact is undeniable. The royal funeral for Edward II took place in December 1327 at Gloucester Cathedral. A body that may or may not have been his was placed in a crypt that remains intact today. The embalming made it impossible to determine whether there were any wounds on the body. After taking power, Edward III pursued those responsible. Gurney was executed, Maltravers was exiled. The death or disappearance of Edward II has become a deep cut in the skin of English history, not only because of its brutality, but because it was the first time an English king had been legally deposed. A shocking event that shook the belief that royal power was sacred and unchallenged. From then on, the ghost of Edward II haunted subsequent kings. The image of a ruler brought down by personal passion, by sexual error, became a stereotype classic in Western culture. Many other kings, such as James I and Henry III, have been similarly tarnished, as if history were punishing those who dared to be true to themselves. Edward II may have died, burned alive from within as a ritual of purification, or he disappeared, taking his identity and pain with him, living on as a shadow. But either way, his story remains a cruel lesson in the tragedy between the human heart and the cold Iron Throne. Nearly 700 years later, Edward II's alabaster tomb still lies serene and majestic in Gloucester Cathedral, with no trace of the terrors he was known to have. A king who once held all power in his hands, now a silent silhouette under cold stone. Crowds come, looking at that stone face, wondering, is that piece real? Or is it just a shell covering a death, burning alive from within? Perhaps the silence of the tomb is his last word, a muffled word, forever unheard.